in the morning session, we heard a comment by a teacher in Britain saying, you know, before we start having kids think outside the box, I'd like them to, you know, understand what's inside the box. So again, when we hear what Guy was talking about the different ways of assessing creativity or the different ways that assessment can actually drum out creativity, are there trade-offs? Are there trade-offs between assessing what people really recognize as very foundational core competencies like literacy and numeracy and assessing other sets of competencies such as creativity or other types of things? Or does that question really depend on the context and where you live and where you're working?
We just need to be aware that there are very different purposes for assessment. And on a general level, you could say that there's assessment aimed at the micro level, at the meso and at the macro level. And the micro level would be that we focus actually on the individual student. And then it is very important to give very personalized feedback and to tell actually this very particular student where he or she could improve. On the meso level, when we're talking about an entire school or a school district, different questions become relevant. And on a macro level, we are talking about entire educational systems, where again, other questions pop up.
I remember this, I mean, I can show you, I can tell you many instances, but this one was very graphic. We were in a village, talking to a family, and the kids in the family had to do this reading task. And there were 3 sons, and the father was actually lying down. It was summer. He was lying down under this tree, and he asked what we were doing, and we said, this is a reading task, and we want to know if children can read. And he said, oh, my kids go to private school, they can read. And he kept lying down. So the first kid was, you know, maybe 8, and was struggling a little bit. At that point, the father sat up. The second kid was 10. They all went to private school. And he struggled a bit as well. So the father then actually stood up. And by the time he came to the third kid, he didn't know what to do. He said, but I pay fees. He was outraged that he pays fees and his children haven't learned to read. So this, you know, assumption that he had about the fact that things were fine and that things for his kids were finer than for the other kids needed to be shaken. And I think a report card with a score, which just went from, you know, 30% to 40%, may not have quite done it in the way that actually seeing kid after kid doing it really shook him up. And then, you know, he presumably did many things afterwards. But this shaking people out of their assumptions, connecting or at least providing a prism to the reality, and making more people party to the fact that we all together have to get something done. I think that's the kind of process that we feel assessment can kind of fuel, leading to an improvement on all sides and greater participation.
The OECD said a couple of years ago that's not enough. It's not enough to only learn rote knowledge about math, science, and reading, but we need new stuff, and creativity certainly is one of them, which I understand is a very broad term, but there are others as well, which might even be part of creativity, such as problem solving, good exploration, collaboration, teamwork, innovation. And since about 2012, the PISA studies do include assessments for these dimensions, because countries usually say, well, that usually comes along automatically in our educational system. So we teach math and science, and well, then students learn to become good problem solvers and good collaborators at the same time. Well, not necessarily.
Inevitably, there is a place for, I mean, this is a debate, right?
Go for it. Debate.
The high-stakes exams are...
We have to disagree.
Yeah.
That's right.
I told them they had to disagree on something.
I'm an Asian, and I believe there's big value in high-stakes exams because we, especially in countries where we have a lot of people, it's a process in a way to help us to do a ranking, of sorting, and these are painful words, but the question really is, to what purpose do these exams serve? But the challenge here is, if we look back in terms of then, as a nation, how do we move the country forward? They do provide some guide to tell us what is good learning, what are some critical skills that we need to assess for. But of course, there is a challenge. And to me, I think the bigger challenge here is what's the backwash effect? Because if you have summative exams, and we will be talking about forms of assessment later, I think one of the most critical issues is the high-stakes exam drive behavior the fact that people, parents, the social milieu, government, all look at numbers, we become obsessed with the numbers. And that itself becomes then the big problem as well. So I think there's a value to these national exams, international exams, but the challenge is how do people use and gather this kind of data?
I think in the coming year, PISA is going to be tried also in 5 or 6 new countries: Zambia, Tanzania, Senegal, Guatemala, Vietnam, and so on. And that's going to be really fun, I think, especially for people who like nice and tried and tested and validated kinds of items, because they will have a large number of children who are, students who are currently not in school. A lot of girls, a lot of boys, who probably have quite a lot of life experiences by that time, because I think your life experiences increase faster if you're not in school than if you are in school. And then if you bring into this debate having to think about problem solving and creativity, but having to do it for kids who are not in school, this will, I think, really challenge everyone to think about how do you go about assessing collaboration for kids who are, sitting in chairs and tables, as well as, people who are out there fishing or doing whatever. So I think that these opportunities need to be taken a little bit deeper than just the league tables. Because the league tables may serve a certain purpose, but it's a narrow purpose.
Perhaps then we need to have a different language and a different form of assessment. And this is, I think, where it's valuable to highlight Scotland's work, that assessment is for learning, and they came up with 3 strands. That is assessment of learning, which is high stakes, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. And to me, I think this is where it gives us a lot more room and the pedagogical implications to say, how do we look at curriculum design differently? How do we better look at subject matter? Because to me, my argument as a researcher really very much is, I look into creative thinking, and I argue that creative thinking can have a lot of useful skill sets. But very often in the Western model of how do we define creative thinking, we're always looking at cognitive skills. And I have an interest in saying, are skills like this culturally embedded? For example, in Asia, I think creative thinking is a lot more holistic. We also look at emotions, we look at metaphors, we look at abstraction. There's a lot more play of imagination. Whereas the way that we look at a lot of guidebooks that comes from the West is all about, can you teach this skill? Can you do that trait? What are the benchmarks? What are the skill sets that we measure?
Let's get back to Guy's initial question. One of the things he talked about, and it was repeated this morning, was assessment systems in some ways are the tail that wags the dog of education systems. Tony Wagner talked about people measure what they treasure. If you don't assess, it doesn't get taught, etc. So how can we change this?
You can also do it to some extent with technology-based assessment that has been introduced to large-scale assessments over the last years. And I think one huge limitation of, for instance, the league tables or the international rankings is you can only say, okay, country A is better than country B, or student A performed better than student B in the test, but you don't really understand why. With technology-based assessment, you get a lot of more information in terms of what did the students actually do. Where did they fail when solving a problem? Was it because they just didn't take it seriously? Was it because they had a misconception that they never checked? Was it because they didn't apply the right strategy?
There are a lot of the assessment, large-scale assessment culture has come out of contexts where the school systems have been relatively stable and well-regulated and have had universal enrollment for quite some years. And another feature of such school systems is that there is an alignment between curriculum expectations, basic, broad capability of teachers to deliver some of those expectations, of parents to support that, and for the children to be able to have this value added on year. Now, that's kind of the setting that I imagine exists in, let's say, Finland or Denmark or, whatever. But a large part of the world is not like that. So there is a great paper by the economist Lant Pritchett, and you don't need to read the paper because the title is so good that you know everything that's in the paper from the title. It's called The Negative Consequences of Overambitious Curriculum. So there's a curriculum, and this could be a great cartoon, that is just ricocheting out of control. The pace is so high. You have teachers who are somewhere below the level of the curriculum. You have parents, In India, we have 50% of the mothers of children who are in school in rural India have not had much schooling themselves. So they are somewhere on this picture. And you have children, as a result, who are many grade years behind. Now, in this kind of setting, clearly there needs to be some alignment between what is possible and how can we deliver it better and what kind of expectations we should have.